Drop them on. Next is extra.
That's what I said.
You put comments in.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
But I missed something.
He goes to the page here. Trade.
So I thought I was going to get your papers done until about 30 seconds left in the game. Then the third martini started and I decided to stop. So, in the words of Janis Joplin, that was a bummer. It's a hard one to watch. You will find on Canvas a whole slew of articles with different topics. Most of these are short, like one-page stuff. Some are a little longer. We're going to do minimum wages on Wednesday. And I think we'll do rent control next. And then we'll do quotas and price discrimination. You should try to read this. You should get comfortable with get comfortable with the theoretical stuff, and then you should be able to read them pretty easily. So I want to go back to one thing I was doing the other day. So what we're doing is going through a set of 6 or 7 or 8 different policy applications to the theoretical pieces you now have the tools to use. There are these, and then there are price ceilings and price floors if we want to describe them differently. And just very quickly, the price floor is probably the easiest one to go through. Again, these are agriculture. You showed that if you have a price floor, and it's actually above the equilibrium price, somehow you're going to have to get this stuff bought up. And what happens is this is the quantity that's demanded, and this is the quantity that's supplied. So you have excess supply. And the reason you have excess supply is because you're a farmer or you're somebody else out there and somebody is saying, we're gonna guarantee you a minimum price. So you don't have to look at market equilibrium anymore in a sense. All you have to look at is what's the price the government's gonna pay you for this stuff. So this distance here becomes your surplus. And that's the government buying stuff up. And the inefficiencies that occur because all this stuff from here on out is being produced at costs above what demanders are willing to pay for. That's why there's an inefficiency here. In an excess supply of stuff and it's being produced at high costs, which is what the supply curve reflects. Surplus leads to government purchases. Everybody okay with that? That's the easiest one of these. It should be pretty easy to go through when you see this. The next one I want to go through is a price ceiling. So a price ceiling are things like wage and price controls, or a really common one in the United States is rent controls, where PC is less than the equilibrium price. And this is the part I want to make sure that you're tuned into here. Look up a second. And this particular price, so the price that's dictated by whatever government authority or whatever initiative says that's the price going to be. This is how much producers are willing to supply. In other words, that's going to be your threshold supply amount. Okay? This is going to be how much demanders demand. So I'm going to the supply curve and the demand curve. And what is this? That's a shortage. So what normally happens when you have a shortage? You don't have a price control, what happens in the marketplace? The price is going to be driven back up because consumers are going to bid it up. As they start bidding it up, producers will produce more of it, and you'll end up with PE. If you can't do that, you've got QS out there being supplied in the marketplace. The question is, how do you distribute these goods and services? This, in some sense, is the essence of what we think of as a market system. Prices normally allocate resources to people who want it and allocate resources to things that they want produced. In a situation like this is how much is willing to, the producers are willing to supply, but C2. That's the price demanders are willing to pay for that many of those things. So the question is, what's the difference between PC and P2? Well, we're trying to figure out a way to allocate this. So we mentioned in some instances, you can ration by weighting, for instance. But just like everything else, there's a market for stuff. Look up a second. So QS is what's being supplied in the marketplace. We know that firms are going to sell this stuff, and this is actually going to be what? That's their total revenue. That's their total legal revenue. Just the price control times the quantity supplied. But they're sitting there and they've got QS of these things. They're either housing units or they're gallons of gasoline or their food if you're in Russia. Or anybody following what's going on in Venezuela. They're running out of food. It looks like the Soviet Union 25%, nothing on the shelves. That's because they don't have any money from the oil. So nothing's being imported. So they're trying to figure out how to ration what they have because they have price controls. So this red stuff is potentially either, for these people, if you just run up and you buy this stuff with PC and you value it at the marginal amount, P2 or more, what is this stuff? Pardon me?
Non-exclusive income.
It's not exclusive income, but in this particular case, if the demander gets it, what is it?
Consumer surplus.
It's consumer surplus. So the non-exclusive income in what I just described becomes consumer surplus because that's who gets it, the demander gets it. But what if there's key money? What if I go ahead and say, yeah, you can have this apartment per month, but you need to pay this much per month for the key? Then what is this stuff? It's producer surplus. So what's going to happen is that the consumer and the producer are essentially going to compete with this. They're going to try to figure out ways where they gain some of this non-exclusive income and turn it in either into consumer surplus if they're the consumer side, or producer surplus if they're the producer side. In any case, you still have losses of consumer surplus and producer surplus. But what economists say is, and what they're doing when they're competing for this stuff, is they're dissipating income. They have potential gains from trade, but they use a lot of this up by competing it away. They compete for weight, or they stand in line, and they stand in line for hours and hours and hours, and that has value. So they're dissipating what that value is going to be. So this is the piece I wanted to make sure that you had a hold of. We're going to call this non-exclusive income. And it can be either consumer surplus producer surplus, or it gets dissipated. And what I mean by dissipated is that it's sort of consumer surplus and producer surplus, but the producer and the consumer don't get it. They spend money, extra money to go ahead and get this. They wait in line. They pay the guy $50 for an oil change when they should be paying him $10 for an oil change. There are all sorts of different things going on. We create all these inefficiencies. It's interesting when you read the rent control stuff in New York City, you're going to see that there was key money got outlawed in the stores. There's furnished apartments are really popular. They have most of those things wrapped up in different ways. You never see those apartments anymore go up for rent. My brother got, this is great, he ran the emergency room at Harlem Hospital for 7 years, so they give you cheap, Columbia gives you cheap housing. So he had a 3-bedroom apartment facing the Hudson River, and he paid $1,300 a month for the thing for 7 years. Now it's never, Columbia never changed the rent, they never do anything. It's a rent control unit. All the faculty there are tied into all these great rent control deals. But what that does is just dries up the rent in other places. It causes huge lobbying. So the questions of rent control in New York City change all the time, and who's in favor of them and what they want. And there's huge amounts of money spent on lobbying and things like that. And we'll see the same thing here. If we start discussing rent control ordinances the way we see them discussed in these articles you're going to read, we'll see all sorts of dissipation and potential changes and lots of things going on. The other interesting thing is we're going to see, I guess this could wait, but it just popped in my head. We have all these new apartments, especially the ones in Capitol Hill. I mean, literally hundreds and hundreds of them. And hundreds of them downtown too. So there will be a fight between landlords who have built stuff in the last 5 years and landlords who have built stuff longer than that. And someone will start trying to get it. They say, okay, rent control is great, but not for new stuff. New stuff is, these people have to get their investments back. They're trying to impose it on the old stuff. So we'll start to see little fighting lines, battle lines set up over this sort of thing. Okay, whenever you see a rent control or a price control of any sort, assume that there's some sort of non-exclusive income there, and they have to figure out another way to distribute those goods and services. And what's interesting as economists for us is to go look at this is what sort of systems develop, because what you want is you want to get this. So if you're clever and you're the gas station owner, you want to get as much as you can, so you charge 60 or 70 bucks for the oil change every week. If they pass all these laws that say that if you charge key money, you go to jail for 5 years, then you can't collect that rent anymore. So consumers are going to do it. But as we'll see, it causes lots and lots of distortions in the workplace. Do you have any questions on the theoretical part of this stuff, these two at this point? Okay. We're going to move on to one of the, for lack of a better term, also more elegant graphical solutions in economics. And that's international trade and the gains from international trade. And we did some of this actually the first day of school. So we're going to start by, first we're going to look at two demand and supply worlds, where demand and supply are separate, two countries, essentially. And we're going to say, okay, we're starting off and they have different demand for whatever this good and different supply for whatever this good. In other words, their costs are different in producing them. And at least initially, they don't trade. And you know, these sorts of things, until 100 years ago, were very complicated. As a matter of fact, until about 1920, most of the revenue that the United States government got was by charging for restrictions on trade. So there were tariffs. So we had all sorts of, which we'll get to, but we had all sorts of restrictions on trade of one sort or another. Less common today, but what you're seeing going on, the change that's occurring in Cuba, and what's going on in Russia right now with sanctions, and to some extent what's going on in Venezuela, but that's sort of a different situation, but there are trade issues involved. The barriers to trade that exist cause tremendous costs on this country, so we're seeing this in a modern world. Just to close the So we'll start with the U.S. automobile market. There was a thing on Bloomberg television this morning on Rolls Royces. How many How many Rolls Royces do you think they produce in a year?
1,000.
4,000? It's up to 4,000. Like 2,800 of them are sold in the United States. And about half of them are custom. In other words, people come in and say, oh, this is a piece of wood from Grandpa's old oak tree. I want that for the dashboard. It's amazing, amazing production. Fun to fantasize about. That's what gets me to buy my Powerball ticket once a month. Okay, so, as you're doing this, leave yourself room to go sideways. You're going to have 3 graphs across. It might be better to take a page and go totally sideways. And in the United States, we're assuming that demand is relatively high to start with. Okay, so it starts high and it stays high for a while. And we'll just assume for now that this is demand and supply curve of U.S. automobiles, and we're just going to assume that this is relatively high. So the entry point here is relatively high relative to what we're going to look at in another country. And this is, in a sense, not unrealistic. What we're going to describe and the arguments we're going to hear as I go through this are real arguments that occurred over a long period of time in the 1970s and 1980s, and occurred a little bit today, but not as much, because the foreign producers have figured out a solution to it in a way. So in the United States, we have the quantity with the superscript 1, because we're going to have another quantity in a few minutes, of cars sold and the price of cars sold. And at this point in time, all we have is American cars. This could be lots of other things. This could be agricultural products, this could be steel, it could be a bunch of stuff, which we'll get to later. And then we're going to look at Japan. And I guess before we look at Japan, we'll do our cute little, where are my colors? So the blue stuff is no free trade, U.S. consumer surplus. And the red stuff is no free trade, U.S. producer surplus. And everybody's just going on their merry way. So you end up with equilibrium price and quantity. And we haven't gone through this, but what is underneath the supply curve is what we normally think of the cost of production. That's why producers aren't willing to spend anything to produce these things unless they get a price above that supply curve, because there are costs involved. And then I need to be careful with this. now we have a Japanese marketplace. We've got a demand and supply curve, and we have an equilibrium price and quantity. And we have that stuff, and we've got that's consumer surplus when there's free trade, and this stuff is producer surplus. There's free trade. And what we're assuming here is we're dealing with pretty much the same generic thing called a car. But we're also assuming two other things about these societies. One is that demand for automobiles in the United States is basically higher than it is for the Japanese. And we're simply saying that's because they enter higher and the Japanese enter the market at a lower price. And we're also saying that the Japanese have lower costs. That's what the supply curve being lower actually means. It means they have lower cost of production. They have better technology, or they have cheaper labor, which is one of the more common explanations for this. But it results, if they're separate, if they're kept separate, it results in different amounts being produced and different amounts, or excuse me, different prices. So the next question is, what happens if these two countries start trading? So if you study Japanese history, or if you study U.S. naval history, you'll know that a situation like this actually did occur in the 1800s, where the Japanese shogun refused to open up trade, and the United States wanted to trade with them, so Admiral Perry, I believe, went into Tokyo Bay and said he was going to blow up the royal castle unless they opened trade up. So they opened trade up. That's how we started having trade with Japan. Sort of an obnoxious American admiral thinking we ought to have free trade. So this has actually occurred by force. So, and now what we're going to do is say, okay, what happens if? We have free trade. So here's the U.S. and Japan. And I think Melanie thought I was a little nuts because I was bringing a ruler and she thought I was going to use it to wrap people's knuckles. There's actually a fairly interesting, so actually I should say, we'll start by constructing the demand curve. So until prices fall to here, the only people that are going to buy cars are who? Americans. In other words, the Japanese are not in the market for cars as long as the price is above that. So we start out with this part of this demand curve is the U.S. alone. So we can stick that. Entry is about there. And it gets to about there. So this is U.S. alone. And then what happens? Then you start having the Japanese start entering the marketplace. So at this particular price, and we'll just do it across slightly. So at that particular price, whatever that happens to be, look up so you can see who this is. At that price, there's that much US demand, right? And there's that much Japanese demand. And there's, what price is that? That much total demand. You only have to do this once in straight line demand curves. So you get a kink. But all you're doing is adding these things horizontal. That's all you've done here. And you can just, if you do it at some point, I did it at this particular dollar point, you end up with a kink in the demand curve. So now this demand curve has both Japanese consumers and American consumers in the model. Likewise, everybody okay with that? What we're doing is, this is in fact no different than just saying, okay, first we're going to look at the demand curve for automobiles in the state of Washington. And then we're going to say, so we can plot that, and then we go ahead and say we're going to look at the demand curve on the West Coast. So we have to add Oregon and California to it. Whenever you're adding to a marketplace like this, the demand curves are getting flatter all the time. And you typically have kinks in them, unless they're the same elasticity spread. So, now we'll go the other direction. So what can you tell me about Japan and the United States in terms of production of automobiles?
The US produces more.
Maybe. It produces at a higher price, right? But as price starts to rise, let's say we're going from 0 on up for automobiles. Which country is going to produce a car first? The Japanese are. See that? As we're going up, we're starting from this point. As we get to here, the Japanese start producing cars. That's what this is saying. The United States doesn't start producing cars till we get up to there. That's because there's $2,842.72 of healthcare costs in every American car. I made that up, but I bet I'm not off by more than 10%, something like that. It's expensive. Does anybody know? Let's put this in the back of your head, we'll come back to it in 3 weeks. Do you know that we're the only country in the world where the employer provides health care? It's the responsibility of the employer, not the government, where it's provided. And the reason is because in the late 1940s, after World War II, the unions did not want to be taxed on higher income. So they said, give us health care and let's go see if we can get government to make it tax exempt. So they made it tax exempt. So that's where it came from. It came from originally from union agreements. Now we're sort of stuck with it. But we'll come back to that in full later on. So here's where they enter. And until you get to here, this is the US entry price. So this starts out looking just like it would in Japan. And then the same thing occurs. You've got, let's just do this price again. The Japanese produce this much, look up. So I've got to go to that price and that quantity. That's Japanese production at that price. And this is American production. And you add the two of them together and see if we can come close to this. And that's somewhere about there. Less than something. Now, if I were a real pain in the neck, I'd tell you that you had to, for homework, get graph paper out and do these exactly. The nice thing about these things is if you do these exactly, the reason I'm doing it with a ruler here is we get pretty close. If you do these things exactly, the outcomes, you'll see the outcomes predictable and they're very definitive answers to certain questions. So the reason I said this is sort of an elegant solution is it gives you very definitive answers. And even though it's a bit complicated in what you're doing, it's still, it proves itself to be a valuable tool. So now we have, there's the world quantity and world price. E-world. And in this particular situation, we have US producers and Japanese producers, and we have US consumers and Japanese consumers. And what we'll see is, if we're just looking at the world situation, look up a second. This area here, this little funny jag in it, is consumer surplus, and this area is producer surplus. And there should be a little kink there. Why should there be a kink there? Because costs in the United States go up faster than the cost in Japan, so you'd expect a little, that supply curve. When the Americans enter the marketplace, it should go up a little bit. So we'll be off a little bit in the drawing, but we're close. So by coincidence, we end up with a world price about P-world, P-world. Sloppy again. So again, we have free trade here. But all of a sudden, we can start talking about certain things going on. What's happened to the, before I do that, what can you tell me about the price when you open up trade relative to the price in Japan and the price in the United States prior to trade? This is always going to be the case. It's always going to be in between the two. In other words, in one country you're going to have low-cost production and lower demand, or a different price. In the other country you're going to have a higher one, and you're going to end up somewhere between the two. So we're ending up between this price and this price. So you're always going to end up between the two of those. And we can see right away there are some funny things going on. What do the Japanese consumers think of free trade in automobiles?
They don't like it.
I don't know if they like it. Consumer surplus went poof. That's their new consumer surplus. The price rose there. So what do Japanese producers think? They think this is wonderful. They're all of a sudden, they're not driving Japanese cars anymore. They're driving Mercedes-Benzes. You know? Now they have producer surplus, and it's this whole triangle that looks like that. Everybody with me? You see where that comes from? You're going to have to do this. So make sure you ask questions now. Okay? So all we've done there is put a different price line on there. We can show a consumer surplus. We can show a producer surpluses. Now the next question is, forget about equity and warm and fuzzies and anything like that. I'm just asking you an accounting question. Okay? Is Japan better off with free trade or worse off with free trade? And where we're measuring better or worse in terms of total gains from trade. How are they better? But how do you measure in terms of gains from trade? The total gains from trade. Okay. Keep in mind, this is
So it's the area.
their gains from trade are now going to be this consumer surplus and this producer surplus. The consumers aren't happy because they used to get this much. Where did this stuff go? The blue stuff used to be consumer surplus. What is it? Look up and say, see this. Blue stuff, little dots, used to be consumer surplus. What is it now? It's producer surplus. So part of what free trade is doing in the country with the lower costs is it's transferring consumer surplus away from consumers to producers. So some of that ends up in the producer's pocket, which is what happened here. The producers still get their old producer surplus, but they've taken the stuff that used to be consumer surplus. What is this stuff? What is that?
Gains from trade?
That's gains from trade. That's the increase, it happens to be producer surplus in Japan, in total gains from trade that happens in Japan by opening up this marketplace. We'll come back to this in a second. Okay. Everybody see that? All we're looking at here is total gains from trade in Japan and what goes to consumers and what goes to producers in each of the scenarios, with trade and without trade. And that's all we've done so far. Now, if we switch over to the United States, we need 12 colors. The price has gone down in the United States to here. What's this is what? That's the new consumer surplus. Consumer surplus has gotten larger because you've had a decrease in price. What is that? That's the new producer surplus. Okay, so producer surplus used to be all of the red line. Now it's the smaller area. What happened to this stuff? Used to be producer surplus. It gets transferred to consumers. What's this stuff? Those are actual gains from trade. So what we have in a scenario when you open up trade in the marketplace is you have unambiguous gains from trade in both countries. However, in this particular country, who likes it? Consumers like it. Their price has gone down. And in fact, in the United States, a lot of the gain in standard of living over the last 25 years in the United States has been caused by a real decrease in the cost of items that are imported. We just have a lot of cheap stuff, and it's good quality stuff, and consumers gain by it. But producers hate it. So you've got increase in total gains from trade here, increase in total gains from trade here. The way we've happened to draw it, the producers in Japan are the happiest of all. But you can start looking at this and saying, well, who's going to do the lobbying? Well, if you look historically in the United States, the producers of automobiles for years and years and years and years tried to keep foreign automobiles out of the country. And in fact, they had quotas on them for years. And we had tariffs. How did the foreign producers of automobiles solve that problem? Rolls-Royce didn't do this, but just about everybody else did. If you buy a Toyota Corolla, where do you think it's produced? Tennessee. They're here. BMW's here. I don't know if Mercedes is here or not, but BMWs are produced here. VWs are produced here. Toyotas are produced here. They got around this problem by simply saying, okay, we'll just take the profits out, we'll produce the stuff over there, and that way the unions will be honest, which has been pretty effective. So is everybody with me so far, at least on this part? So what we have is you have two countries. You have different costs of production, which is reflected in the supply curves, and different demands. When you put them together, you typically have gains from trade. And you typically have one country that has at some point lower costs. Those producers are going to gain. And it doesn't mean that you totally stop production of US cars in the US. It simply means that there's a shift in who's producing them. And likewise, we don't go to zero consumption of automobiles in Japan. We go to fewer automobiles being produced or consumed in Japan. And incidentally, Japan has been plagued for, they talk about the lost decade in Japan, it's more like the last 20 years, by lack of domestic consumption. They've had really slow economic growth because all of the money that they've gained has gone into the production side and hasn't gone into lower cost of goods and services. So they're always fumbling around. That's why we see changes of governments every 3 years there. So we have these gains from trade, we have unambiguous gains from trade. If you look at the history of trade laws in the United States, so for instance, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or the newer Pacific Agreement, or the even newer one with Colombia and a couple in Panama, you will always see this is the general argument that, hey, we're better off. There's going to be larger gains from trade. So I want you to understand that. I mean, this is one of those unambiguous results of doing careful economic analysis. You always end up, in terms of total gains from trade, being, quote, better off. Now, having said that, what are the problems? So, if in fact, in the United States, we're cutting back from this supply to this supply, we're still selling that much. How do we get there? Or we close down automobile plants, or we cut labor, or we add technology and cut more labor. It's also pretty unambiguous that when you do these sorts of analysis, you end up with the Japanese having trouble buying automobiles because they're too darn expensive, because the Americans are buying them. And you end up with Americans losing jobs. So, it is true, if you do this for lots and lots of goods and lots of services, you would think that over time it evens out. But it may take a long time. If you're unemploying a bunch of people in Michigan, unemployment is that way. If you're firing a bunch of people in Michigan from the plants, and they become unemployed, and they're 52 years old, and the only thing they've ever done is weld frames of automobiles together, they may have trouble adjusting, and they may have long-term problems. And typically with these agreements, we try to do training programs, and we try to do this and that and the other thing. But I suspect a lot of what we've seen in terms of income equity over the last 25 or 30 years, where incomes have become less equal and there's been a real decline in wage growth, a lot of it has to do with the relative differences between these things. And in the United States, there are businesses where the owners of capital, these guys that are producers, have done really well in making foreign trade, where they invest overseas or whatever the case may be. In other cases, they do not. So if you think for a second, you go, okay, what do we do with televisions? So as far as I can tell, every television in the world today is produced in China. So who gains from that? I got to watch that appalling end of the football game on my 100-inch television yesterday. It cost me not very much. And I'm sure the price is going to go down even more. Actually, before the price goes down, they now have a new technology that's a curved screen, which has anybody seen on TV yet? Can you tell the difference? I can't tell the difference in what I have. But the new technologies, prices are falling. I think it's wonderful. However, RCA and The other American company, GE, Sylvania, all used to produce televisions in the United States. All those plants are closed. All those guys that used to produce those things are out of work, and girls, most of the guys. So there's a loss on that side. There's a gain to me as a consumer. Who's gaining? Who else is gaining by these wonderful televisions being produced and invented? So our wages haven't increased realistically at the lower end of the scale. They haven't increased in 35 years in real terms. Okay? And that's probably a lot because of this. The manufacturing jobs have left. There are lots of other reasons. There are a lot more people in the workforce than there used to be in relative terms. We'll come back to that later. But what's going on in China? Incomes in China are going through the roof relative to where they were 35 years ago. Why is that? Because they're like the Japanese that we drew here. They're producing all these electronics or whatever else they're producing. And how are they producing it? They're hiring Chinese laborers. The Chinese laborers are going into the marketplace, they're working in plants, they're getting more sophisticated, they're making silicon chips and computers and all this stuff. What's happening to their wages? Their wages are going up. So our wages may be flat here, but in some other place where we're getting these cheap goods from, wages have to be rising because they're making this stuff. So what's happening, and what you can see in these international trade models, is you start to see, oh, there's some imbalance occurring, but the imbalance is part of the marketplace taking place. And this is where you start saying, actually, you don't hear this argument very much because people don't like to discuss it very much. But the wage problems that we're seeing in the United States are not happening in lots of other parts of the world, particularly the poorer parts of the world where we're starting to go produce goods and services. So we have to want that as a part of the trade. I think when Bill Clinton started pushing for free trade agreements, he understood that there were going to be costs in the United States, but he also understood that if we're trading with the Chinese, or we're trading with the Cubans, which he didn't have the nerve to do, if you make us more dependent on each other economically, there's less likelihood that we're going to be shooting at each other. So that's, in some sense, a lot of our trade policy becomes our foreign policy, that we're trying to get ourselves much more intertwined. So what happens in 10 or 15 years in Cuba when all of a sudden it's got some manufacturing plants and it's got great resorts and there's lots of free trade with Cuba? The Cubans are going to be better off. Americans are going to like traveling there. We're going to get cheaper cigars and better rum. Better music, and way better baseball. There's all sorts of things that are going to occur. But the more it happens, the more that trade occurs, the less likelihood we're going to have other sorts of conflicts with them. So this free trade model that we run through has all sorts of repercussions filtering through it. Very interesting to watch. I'm trying to think if there are any on the horizon. Cuba's the one to watch more than anything right now. Right now, you're free to go to Cuba, but there's not much else that's tied to that. In another 10 years, I suspect we'll see a lot more trade with Cuba going on. Okay, questions on this part of this so far? Okay, take a 5-minute break and then we're going to do quotas and tariffs.
Show improvement. So cute. No. This is the Really? I think you should tell me I've done but like, I feel like that's guys who get nervous. It's like,
So over the last 40 years or so, 50 years, in an effort to open up trade more and more, it's not good when there's sort of scattered amounts of free trade. So what the United Nations has done and other organizations have done, particularly the World Bank, is try to prevent, actually try to encourage free trade in a general way. And you'll see, you remember maybe when you were in grammar school, probably, the World Trade Organization meetings were in Seattle. That's one organization that's, its goal is encouraging free trade. There's annual meetings that sets up systems to try to help countries become more free trade oriented. And then, in addition to WTO, there's actually a treaty that I think there are probably over 200 countries signed on to it in one degree or another now, called the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. And signatories of that can yell at each other and bring each other to the trade court when they think cheating's going on, that there's dumping, or somebody's imposing tariffs they shouldn't be imposing, or something like that. So these organizations exist out there, and just so you're aware of them, we're going to look at what the impacts, or in general, what could be the impacts of. One is quotas, which is a common way of restricting trade. And the automobile industry tried to do this in a large way in the 70s as the Japanese were entering the marketplace. In textiles, it's always been an issue where imports of textiles were really restricted until the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. So now, there's a good chance that 95% of the clothing you're wearing is not made in the United States. That would not have been true 50 years ago. 3/4 of the clothing would have been made in the South 50 years ago. It's all made overseas. That's because of the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. But what we want to do, and when we look at both sugar and steel, which are the two topic areas we're looking at here, we'll see that quotas have been imposed on both of those for particular reasons. In the steel and in the sugar industry, it's basically a political boondoggle. It's been that way for years. In the steel industry, the steel producers for years and years were able to convince their senators to go argue, this is a national security issue, we don't want foreigners producing our steel. We don't want to be dependent on foreigners for our steel. The other argument has slowly replaced that, so that most of our steel, I wouldn't say most, but probably pretty much close to half of our steel now comes from overseas for a number of different reasons. We can use this to show this. As it turns out, when we started opening trade in steel after World War II, the Germans and the Japanese had, I'm being facetious here, but it's true, the luxury of having their steel plants totally destroyed by Allied bombing in World War II. So they built new steel plants using new technologies. The technologies, and so the cost of their producing steel went way down and became very cheap to buy foreign steel. The Americans did not start redoing their plants and using new processes which tremendously decreased the cost of steel. So they were using some old technology like that. The Japanese and the Germans were using some technology that gives you cost curves that look like that. It took until the late 80s before the Americans finally started doing these small mill technologies that sort of started producing a lot of the steel in the United States and a lot of the metal in the United States. But very quickly, if you have So if you look at the American market, you can see that if you have a world price and there's free trade, we're going to be importing the difference between what actually being consumed in the marketplace and what the Americans are actually producing. That's the difference between these two quantities. So that's the general production amount. If you put a quota on, if you put a tariff on, so let's say the tariff is this many dollars. So for every unit you sell in the United States, it's far enough to put that particular amount on. So this world price goes up to here. This is the price world plus the tariff. So what does that do? Well, what that does is, look out. The quantity produced by the Americans goes up. So you go up the supply curve. The quantity that is coming from overseas actually goes down. That's the quantity total. Because it's more expensive to import those things. So the amount of imports decreases. Everybody see that? New size of imports, old size of imports, and you have two losses that are caused by this. So when you put a system like this in place where you have a tariff, what's that? That's a loss in consumer surplus. It's just there's simply less being bought out there because of the quotas. So if this is steel, this runs all the way to different losses of consumer surplus associated with automobiles and anything that's made of steel. This is also a loss. Both of these are considered deadweight losses of tariffs. Excuse me, I said quotas. Okay. This first loss is just a classic loss in consumer surplus. This is tax revenue over here. That's the amount of stuff being imported times the tariff. And this loss is the deadweight loss associated with producing goods and services more expensively. In other words, wasting production costs because of you're sticking this particular tariff on a good. So with a tariff, you have two types of deadweight loss. One is the loss in consumer surplus, and the one is the production of goods at higher than they should be costing. And that's what those two triangles are. Again, there is an increase in production, and the producers like that, which is why you see them lobbying for it, and why you see the unions lobbying for it. Consumers don't like it, but they're less likely to be screaming about it because it's only one of them talking about $10 on their car. So you don't get as much complaint from the consumer side. You do from the consumer union, and there's arguments, but generally these quotas are put in place because producers are complaining about them in one way or another, or imports in one way or another. In a quota situation, the government comes in and says, okay, up until this point, the US is producing, and we're going to impose a quota. Let's say the quota is this amount. Look up. That's the amount of the quota. What that means is, so they just announced you can only import 10,000 of these cars. What that means is that this supply curve that we're dealing with really looks like in other words, up to this point, the cost of producing these things is going to be at the price of the world price. So Americans will enter the industry at prices below that up to a certain point. But once you get this amount of output, once the quota has been satisfied, then we're looking at the American supply curve. And then we end up with this new Q star. That's loss of consumer surplus. Again, it's just the same sort of thing going on. Consumers are spending more money than they have to on particular goods. And what is this? That's also a deadweight loss, this time of a quota, and it's the extra cost above what other producers. In other words, that's what it costs the US producers in addition to what it costs foreign producers. That's all this thing is saying. As soon as you get above this. Both of these are deadweight losses of the quotas. They cause the same problem. Okay, on Wednesday, we're going to do minimum wages. Make sure you read those two pieces. We're going to read them as price control, price floor. And we'll run through these things really quickly, make sure you have them before we do this. Okay, I'll see you That's also part of the big triangle, the two triangles. The red part is the black part is